Bette Davis walked onto the Tonight Show stage on May 22nd, 1986, wearing a blazing red gown covered in sequins that caught every light in the studio, and the audience of 300 people rose to their feet before she had taken 3 steps. But Johnny Carson did not stand up from behind his desk the way he usually did. He sat completely still, watching her cross the stage, and the expression on his face was something the crew had never seen before. Not admiration. Not the practiced warmth he deployed for every guest. Something closer to awe and fear, because Johnny knew something that nobody in that audience knew. He knew what Bette Davis had told his producer on the phone 48 hours earlier. He knew why she had insisted on this particular appearance on this particular night. And he knew that whatever she was about to say on camera would either become one of the most electric moments in Tonight Show history or the most devastating. What he did not know, could not have known, was that Bette Davis had spent the entire afternoon in her dressing room writing and rewriting a single sentence. One sentence she had been trying to say out loud for 30 years, and she was going to say it tonight, on camera, to him, in front of millions of people. Whether he was ready or not, if this story is already pulling you in, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from tonight, because you are going to want to be here for every single second of what comes next. Let us go. May 20th, 1986. 2 days before the taping, Johnny Carson was sitting alone in his office on the 3rd floor of NBC Studios in Burbank when his producer, Fred de Cordova, knocked and entered without waiting. Fred had produced The Tonight Show for 15 years. He was not a man who knocked nervously, but his knuckles that afternoon were barely touching the wood. Johnny looked up from the desk. "What is it?" Fred set a single sheet of paper down in front of him. He did not say anything. He just waited. It was a handwritten note, not typed, not dictated to an assistant. Handwritten in a script that was slightly uneven, the kind of penmanship that belongs to someone who learned to write before the war and never stopped. It read as follows: Johnny, I will be 78 years old in April. I have had 2 strokes. I have had a mastectomy. I have lost more people than I can count. I have been called difficult, impossible, terrifying, and brilliant, sometimes all 4 in the same sentence, sometimes by the same person. I have been making movies since 1931. In 55 years, I have never once said what I'm about to say on your show. Please do not ask me to change my mind. I have earned the right to say it. Betty. Johnny read the note twice, then a 3rd time. He looked up at Fred. Did she say what it is? Fred shook his head slowly. She told me it was personal. She told me it was something she had been holding for 30 years. She told me the only person in the world she trusted to hear it first was you. Johnny set the note down carefully, as though it were made of something that could break. He sat with it for a long moment. Then he told Fred to clear the last segment of the show and not to schedule anyone after her. Fred started to ask why. Johnny's expression stopped him. Just do it. What Fred did not tell Johnny, what he would not reveal until years later in a memoir that received far less attention than it deserved, was the second thing Bette Davis had said on the phone. She had told Fred that if the producers tried to preview or edit whatever she was going to say, she would walk out before the cameras rolled. No previews, no preparation, no safety net. Whatever came out of her mouth that night was going to be the truth, and it was going to be live, and it was going to be the whole thing or nothing at all. Fred had agreed. He had not had a choice. You did not negotiate with Bette Davis. You never had been able to. Not in 1943, not in 1956, not in 1986. That particular fact about the world had never changed. May 22nd, 1986, 4:30 in the afternoon, NBC Studios, Burbank. The Tonight Show was taped at 5:30 for broadcast that night. The crew knew something was different the moment they arrived. The green room was quiet in a way green rooms are never quiet. The lighting director had been asked to make adjustments 3 separate times and still could not get them right, though nobody could explain what was wrong with them. 2 camera operators kept looking at each other across the studio floor without saying anything. The stage manager had not made a single joke since noon, which was unprecedented. Bette Davis arrived at 4:15, earlier than anyone expected. She was wearing the red gown with the sequined bodice that caught the studio lights like shattered glass, and her white hair was swept back with the precise severity of someone who had been making decisions about her appearance for 55 years and had long since stopped letting anyone else make them for her. She walked through the corridor with a cane in her right hand, not leaning on it heavily, carrying it the way a general carries a sword. Not because she needed it, but because it was hers, and she had decided to bring it. A 23-year-old production assistant named Lisa Hartman, who had been working at NBC for less than a year, was stationed outside the green room. She later told an interviewer that the moment Bette Davis passed her in the hallway, she felt something she had never felt before and has never been able to properly explain. She said it was like standing next to a thunderstorm that had decided to wear red. She said she stood against the wall and did not breathe until Bette Davis had turned the corner. Inside the green room, Davis sat alone. She declined the water her assistant offered. She declined the chair adjustment the stage manager proposed. She took the cane and rested both hands on its silver handle and stared at the monitor showing the empty stage, and she did not move for 22 minutes. The stage manager later said he checked on her 4 times. Each time she looked at him with those famous eyes and said nothing. Each time he backed out of the doorway without asking the question he had come to ask. Nobody asked Bette Davis anything she was not ready to answer. That was simply how it had always worked. At 5:10, Johnny walked past the green room. The door was open a few inches. He paused. She looked up. Their eyes met through the gap, and for a moment the whole corridor seemed to hold itself very still. Johnny had known Bette Davis for over 20 years. She had been on the show more than a dozen times. He had interviewed her after her Oscar nominations, after her comeback, after her memoirs, after her illness. He had always known, the way any great observer of human beings always knows, that there was something she was keeping back. A locked room somewhere behind those eyes that she had never opened for anyone. Not on camera, not in print. Tonight he understood the door was going to open. He gave her a single nod. She returned it. He kept walking. Doc Severinson's orchestra opened the show at 5:30, exactly, with something brash and jubilant, and the studio audience filled the room with the particular sound of people who are genuinely happy to be somewhere. Johnny's monologue was sharp that night. A joke about Reagan, a joke about the World Series projections, a bit about the price of gas that landed the way the good ones always land, like something that was already true and just needed someone to say it. The audience laughed, and Johnny moved through it all with his usual easy precision, that particular Midwestern elegance that made everything he did look effortless and therefore look inevitable. But twice during the monologue he glanced toward the curtain. Twice his right hand moved almost imperceptibly toward his jacket pocket where there was nothing, or where there was simply empty fabric. But the hand moved anyway the way hands do when the body knows something is coming that the mind has not yet named. The first guest was a comedian whose name no one present could recall a week later. His segment ran 11 minutes. He told 3 stories that got good laughs. Johnny was generous and warm and present in exactly the way he was always generous and warm and present. And still the crew kept glancing toward the curtain. Then Ed McMahon's voice came through the studio the way it always did, filling the room from somewhere below the sound rather than inside it. Ladies and gentlemen, she has won 2 Academy Awards. She has appeared in over 100 films. She has been working in Hollywood since the age of 22, and she is not finished yet. Please welcome Miss Bette Davis. The audience erupted. Not politely, genuinely. The kind of eruption that belongs to someone who exists beyond the category of celebrity. Someone who has crossed the line from famous into something more permanent and more difficult to name. The orchestra swelled. The curtain moved. And Bette Davis walked out onto the stage in her red sequined gown with her cane in her right hand, and her chin at the precise angle of someone who has never once in her life walked into a room wondering whether she belonged there. Johnny stood from behind his desk. He walked toward her the way he had walked toward very few guests in 30 years of doing this, with something that was not professional courtesy, something that was closer to pilgrimage. He took her free hand in both of his. She looked at him, and then she smiled. And for just a moment the famous severity dissolved entirely, and what was underneath was something startling and rare, which was joy, pure, uncomplicated, real. They settled into their chairs. The red gown pooled around her like something staged by a cinematographer. She set the cane across her knees with both hands resting on it, and looked at Johnny with an expression that the camera caught and that every person watching at home felt without being able to explain why. Johnny leaned forward slightly. So she leaned forward too. So. The audience laughed. And for the first 18 minutes, everything was what it appeared to be. 2 people who had known each other for 2 decades, sitting together in a bright room, having a conversation that sparkled. She told the story about working with William Wyler on Jezebel, and the 36 takes he demanded for a single scene. 36 takes, and by the end she had no idea which version was right, and he had no idea either. And they had argued about it for 4 days, and she had won the Oscar for it, which she considered the finest possible revenge. The audience loved it. She told the story about the first time she walked into a studio in 1931, and the producer looked at her and said, "Who did this to us?" And how she had spent the next 50 years making sure he remembered the answer to that question. Johnny laughed the way he laughed when something genuinely surprised him, which was rare, the laugh that started in the chest rather than the throat. She was magnificent. She had always been magnificent. The room felt it, but the crew noticed something. Her hands on the silver cane handle had not relaxed once. Not during the Wyler story, not during the producer story, not during any of the easy laughter. The knuckles were not white, but they were engaged firmly, with a steadiness that was the opposite of ease. Something was being held in place. Johnny noticed it too. Of course he noticed. He had been reading people for 30 years, and Bette Davis was giving him something to read. He let the conversation breathe. He asked about the new film she had been working on, Whales of August, and she spoke about it with a directness that made it clear she was proud of it, and with a precision that made it clear she was measuring her words the way a surgeon measures an incision. Nothing wasted, nothing that didn't need to be there. And then Johnny asked the question. Not because it was on his card, not because it had been planned. He asked it because the conversation had carried him there the way a river carries something that is not fighting it, gently and without any particular announcement. He leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at her with the kind of openness that was his particular gift, the ability to make someone feel that whatever they said next was the most important thing he had ever been about to hear, and he said, "Bette, in 55 years, has there been anything you have never said out loud? Anything you have carried that nobody knows about?" The studio went quiet the way studios go quiet when something real is about to happen. Not all at once, in layers. At first, the people nearest the stage and then, back and back, until even the control room monitor screen seemed to dim slightly in anticipation. Bette Davis looked at Johnny Carson for a long moment. She looked at him the way she had been looking at him since May 20th, when she had written the note in the handwriting that was slightly uneven, the way she had been looking at him, in some sense, for 30 years. She said yes. One word. The audience didn't make a sound. You are going to want to subscribe right now, because what she says in the next 2 minutes has never been spoken about this way before. Not in any interview, not in any memoir. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because this moment belongs to all of us. Johnny did not lean forward. He did not change his posture. He understood without deciding to understand that any movement, any adjustment, any production instinct would break something that needed to stay whole. He simply looked at her and waited. Bette Davis took one breath. She looked down at her hands on the cane. Then she looked back up. When she spoke, her voice was the same voice she had always had, that instrument tuned somewhere between iron and silk, but it was quieter than usual. Not softer, quieter. There's a difference. She said, I have spent 55 years being told I was too much, too intense, too demanding, too difficult, too honest, too direct, too unwilling to pretend. She paused. The audience was not breathing. She said, every single time someone called me too much, I went home and I wrote it down. I kept a journal. I've kept it since 1936. She said, I want to read you one entry. I want to read it because I am 78 years old, and I've had 2 strokes, and there are things I want to say before I can no longer say them, and this is one of them. She reached into the small evening bag on the side table next to her chair. A bag nobody had paid attention to because everything else about her was so vivid, and she removed a folded piece of paper. Old paper. The fold lines were deep and permanent, the way fold lines become when something has been opened and refolded over many years. She unfolded it carefully on her knee. Johnny's hands were flat on the desk, not gripping anything, just resting there. Still. She said, this is from February 1954. I was 45 years old. I had just finished filming The Virgin Queen. The studio had told me, again, that I was too old for romantic leads, that I needed to reconsider the kinds of roles I was pursuing, that perhaps a more graceful approach to the later years of a career would serve me better than fighting. She looked up from the paper. The later years. I was 45. Someone's daughter in the front row of the audience made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a gasp. Something between the two. She looked back down at the paper. She said, I wrote this on a Tuesday night in my house in Bel Air, after a dinner where I had sat across from 4 men who spent 3 hours explaining my own career to me as though I had not been living it. She paused. She said, I wrote, there will come a day when I will walk into a room and nobody will have the audacity to tell me who I am supposed to be. I do not know when that day is. I do not know if it comes before I die or after, but I know it is coming. And I am going to keep showing up until it arrives. She refolded the paper. She set it on the evening bag. She looked at Johnny. And then Bette Davis said the sentence she had been rewriting all afternoon. The sentence that had been locked in the room behind her eyes for 30 years. She said it quietly and without dramatics and without any of the grand theatrical architecture people who did not know her assumed she always used. Because the truth is that Bette Davis was not theatrical when she was being real. She was simply direct. She said, I showed up every single time for 55 years. When they told me I was finished, I showed up. When they told me I was too old, I showed up. When the parts stopped coming, I found my own parts. When the money ran out, I found more money. When the strokes took things from me, I relearned the things they took. She said, I am not telling you this because I want your pity or your applause. I am telling you this because I am sitting here on this stage in this red dress with this cane, and I am 78 years old, and I worked for this. Every single thing I still have, I worked for, and I am tired of pretending that women who refuse to disappear should be sorry about it." The studio was completely silent. 300 people sitting in absolute stillness. And then, from somewhere near the back, a sound started. Not applause exactly. Something rawer than applause. A kind of sustained exhale that became a roar. That became a standing ovation that the production notes from that evening record as lasting 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Which is approximately 3 minutes and 50 seconds longer than any standing ovation in Tonight Show history up to that point. Johnny Carson did not stand and lead the applause the way hosts sometimes do to signal to the audience that it is appropriate to respond. He sat at his desk with his hand still flat against the surface, and he looked at Bette Davis, and the expression on his face was one that the camera caught and that has been described differently by everyone who has ever seen it. Some people say he looked proud. Some people say he looked moved. His producer, Fred de Cordova, in the memoir that received far less attention than it deserved, wrote that he had never in 30 years seen Johnny Carson look at anyone that way. He wrote that it was the look of a person who has just witnessed something they will spend the rest of their life measuring other things against. The applause finally came down. Bette Davis had not moved during any of it. She sat with her hands on the cane and let it wash over her, and did not perform gratitude and did not perform humility. She simply received it the way she received everything, with complete presence and zero performance, which was perhaps the most theatrical thing she had ever done on a stage, because the people watching it felt it reach straight through the screen and into their chests. Do not go anywhere. What happens in the final minutes of this interview is something Johnny Carson talked about for the rest of his career. If you have not subscribed yet, do it right now. Tell me where you are watching from in the comments. You are going to need to see how this ends. Johnny finally spoke. His voice was different. Not unsteady, different. Lower. He said, "Bette, I need to tell you something." She looked at him. He said, "I have been hosting this show for 24 years. He said, "I have talked to presidents." He said, "I have talked to people who changed history and people who changed cinema, and people who changed the way we understand what it means to be a human being in front of a camera." He stopped. He looked down at his desk for a moment. Then back up at her. He said, "And I have never, not once, in 24 years, interviewed anyone who made me want to be braver than I already am. Until tonight." Bette Davis looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Johnny, you already are." He shook his head slightly. She said it again, quietly, directly, "You already are." The audience made a sound. The sound that people make when something true enters a room and they recognize it before they can name it. When the time came for her to leave, Johnny walked her to the edge of the stage. He offered her his arm, and she took it, not with the performance of fragility, but with the simple acceptance of a person who knows the difference between needing help and accepting it, and who has stopped being ashamed of either. At the curtain, she stopped. She turned back one final time to the audience, to the cameras, to the 300 people standing in that studio and the millions watching from their living rooms. She looked out at all of it the way she had been looking at stages since 1928. Like she owned the room. Like she had earned the right to stand in it. Like she was not going anywhere until she was ready. She said, "I have one more thing." She said, "If anybody is listening tonight who has been told they are too much, who has been told to be quieter, smaller, easier, more convenient, less honest, more palatable, I want you to hear this from someone who knows." She paused. She said, "They were wrong about me, and they are wrong about you." She turned and walked through the curtain. The studio erupted one final time, and did not stop for a very long time. Bette Davis died on October 6, 1989, 3 years after that taping. She was 81 years old. She had finished filming The Wicked Stepmother just weeks before her death and had refused to stop working until the very end, which surprised nobody. Johnny Carson spoke about that evening in interviews for the rest of his life. He said it was the night he understood something he had not understood before about what courage actually looks like when it is not performing itself. He said it was the night he realized that the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to apologize for existing at full volume. Fred de Cordova kept the handwritten note Bette Davis had sent 2 days before the taping. He kept it framed on his office wall. When people asked him what it said, he told them to watch the interview. He said everything she wrote in that note she said on camera. He said she had always been true to her word. He said that was one of the most frightening and most magnificent things about her. The journal she mentioned, the one begun in 1936, the one that contained the February 1954 entry she read on the show, was donated to the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences after her death. The archivist who cataloged it said there were entries for almost every year from 1936 onward. She said the handwriting changed across the decades, became sparser and then fuller again, became less certain and then more certain again, became, toward the end, the handwriting of someone who had made peace with something. She said the last entry was dated September 28, 1989, 8 days before Bette Davis died. She said it contained 5 words. She would not say what they were. She said some things belonged only to the person who wrote them, but the archivist said one other thing. She said that the last entry was not in the slightly uneven script of someone whose hand had been affected by illness. She said it was written in the same precise, forceful penmanship as every other entry in the journal going back to 1936. She said it was the handwriting of a woman who had decided to show up one more time, who had always decided to show up one more time, who had never, in 55 years, made any other decision. If this story moved something in you, subscribe to this channel right now because we bring you the moments that television almost forgot. The moments that changed people in the dark of their living rooms when nobody was watching. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Share this with someone who has ever been told they were too much. Because Bette Davis spent her whole life proving that too much is exactly enough. And on a Thursday night in May of 1986, in a red sequined gown with a silver-handled cane and 55 years of refusal behind her, she said so out loud. And 30 million people heard it. And some of them are still carrying it. And now, so are you.